from different places. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this distinguished book talk by Dr. Himanshu Jha, who is currently a lecturer and research fellow at the South Asia Institute of the Heidelberg University. The book talk that we are going to have today is on Himanshu's latest book, which is Capturing Institutional Change, which is recently published by the University of Oxford Press. We are delighted to have him here in our departmental book talk. Dr. Himanshu has published quite extensively on governance and on issues of public welfare in some of the noted journals, including Pacific Affairs, Economic and Political Weekly, in their review, and in the Washington Quarterly, among others. He has also two books which are forthcoming this year. One is a standalone monograph on public policy and governance in India, which is being published by Palgrave Macmillan. And he is also co-editing an edited book with Jivanta Sotli, which is being published by Routledge on globalization and governance in India. We are really thankful to Dr. Himanshu for having agreed and having shown interest in speaking about his book before us. I'll not stand much between you and Dr. Himanshu, who would have around 40 minutes of presentation of his book, and it will be followed by discussion. Professor Kailas would be discussing his book for around 10 to 15 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for the audience for question and answer. I would request you to post your questions in the chat box so that we have a seamless discussion after Professor Kailas flags some of the issues that emerged from his presentation, as well as his readings of the book by Dr. Himanshu. So without much ado, I'll request Dr. Himanshu to take over, present his book for around 40 minutes. Then we'll give the floor to Professor Kailas. Then we'll have an open discussion of the book. Thank you so much, and may I invite Himanshu to make his presentation.
Thank you, Suhan. First of all, thanks to the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, for organizing this talk on my book. I'm also thankful to the colleagues who have actually organized it and worked in the background. And I'm delighted to be here. And I'm also doubly delighted that two of my alma maters, Suhan and Kailash, are here and are presiding in the event. And hopefully they will be kind when they will be giving comments on my book. This research, I will just share the screen. Can you just allow me to share the screen for?
Yes, you are enabled. You should
go ahead. Yeah, Himanshu.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can.
Right. So, this research is using the historical institutional lens to explain the why, what, and how of institutional change by essentially tracing the passage of Right to Information Act 2005. And picking up from the title of the book, Capturing Institutional Change, I define institutions, and there are, institutions have been variously defined as, informal, formal rules of the game, informal, formal norms, or standard operating procedures, or interrelated rules and routines of the game. And so I derive the definition of institutions from these established definitions. But institutions also have this bad habit of actually persisting on the historical landscape. They are path dependent on history, and that's why it is kind of cost ineffective to exit from the status quo. Institutional persistence also kind of leads to these vast, elaborate social and political network And they, along with these persisting institutions, stick as well. And so whenever, the path of persisting institutions or the institutional path is altered or changed, it kind of poses a puzzle for social scientists. And, Professor Mukherjee, for instance, has looked at the 1991 economic reforms as a case of institutional change, or Peter Hall has actually looked at, the shift from the Keynesian policy to the monetarist policy in Great Britain in his famous article, 1993 article. So when a path of a persisting institution kind of changes, it poses a puzzle for social scientists. And in my book, I argue that, right to information actually poses a kind of a similar puzzle, and it's also a saga of persistence and change. The first 60 years of India's independence, the whole transparency regime was governed by these archaic laws which promoted and even strengthened the norm of secrecy and weakened the citizens' right to know. So you had civil services, you had Official Secrets Act 1923, you had Civil Services Conduct Rules of 1961, you had sections 1, 2, 3 of the Indian Evidence Act. In 1967, the Official Secrets Act was amended to an even stronger version to make both sharing and receiving information as a bailable, as cognizable offense. And then in 1994, you had this amendment to the Manual of Department Security Instructions, which was actually used to classify and declassify official information. So the norm of secrecy was completely entrenched within the state. And for the first 6 decades of India's independence, governance was completely shrouded in secrecy. This changed with the promulgation of Right to Information Act 2005, which actually gives access to official information to its citizens, a legal regime where citizens can access information. Information is clearly defined. There is an elaborate procedure of penalties and so on and so forth. We know what RTI entails. And so it kind of represents a kind of a before and after, a contrasting picture, right? Why should RTI be treated as a case of institutional change? It should be treated as a case of institutional change on 3 counts. The first is that it represents a norm shift, kind of rearrangements, borrowing from the definition of institutions, kind of rearrangements in the rules of the game, a shift from the nested norm of secrecy to a new norm of openness, which emerged on the ground with right to information. The second thing is that RTI has got no policy precursor. It does not represent a policy continuity. Unlike the other rights-based regimes promulgated during the same period, like Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act or Right to Education, this whole package of rights which was promulgated during around the same period, they all had policy precursors. So it represented a kind of a policy continuity. Right to information, where citizens had a legal right to access information from the state, had no policy precursor. So in a way, it marked a kind of a policy departure. The third thing why it's a valid case of institutional change is that the change is both de jure and de facto, in a sense that Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution has itself been interpreted as inherently containing right to know, right? So the change is both constitutional and statutory, unlike the other rights-based regimes, unlike the other rights-based act, where the shift is just represented from the transition from the marriage of the directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights. Here, the fundamental right itself of freedom and expression and speech has been interpreted as inherently containing right to know. So, and that's why, on these 3 counts, I argue that right to information is somewhat different from the other rights-based approach and can be regarded as a valid case of institutional change. Now, right to information is to me, I start off in the book with this puzzle. Right to information for me poses a puzzle, right? The first puzzle is that why would state decide to turn the page and initiate a change in the legal regime which was persisting right since independence, amended from time to time to make it even stronger? Why would state do that? puzzle deepens because, Indian state is kind of viewed as this state which is captured by this nexus of vested interests. So you see this plethora of research on clientelism, patronage politics, business politics nexus. Why would state change the legal regime, which would be used variously to highlight the very nexus said to govern the institutions of the state? Indeed, RTI has been used to expose both grand and petty corruption. RTI has opened up the state for scrutiny, and unsurprisingly, the state has since 2006, 2007, at the very outset when right to information was actually promulgated, state has been actually making efforts to dilute the law, right? Why would state initiate a legal change in the legal regime which would be used variously to expose or highlight the very nexus said to govern these institutions? So this kind of paper represents the contrasting before and after picture. So this communique from the Prime Minister's office, or this communique from the DOPT, Department of Personnel and Training, I could not have accessed it if this was in the pre-RTI period. It was only because of RTI, the papers which were marked confidential were accessible, was open to a citizen after right to information. I would have been in jail if I would have found it, if they would have found me in possession of these documents before RTI, right? So RTI presents a before and contrasting picture. It's a case of institutional change. And, there are dominant narratives. There are dominant explanations, and these are somewhat settled explanation of about the evolution of right to information. The first narrative is about the people's movement, the social movement narrative, where the demand from the grassroots up actually put pressure on the state, and the state yielded to that pressure and opened up to scrutiny, right? The second is a most recent work where it argues that it was not actually a social movement. It was a dense interpersonal network of elite, which was consequential, which it is closer to the argument which is made about the elite revolt against the deregistered state. And so in the same vein, this argument holds that right to information was a result of kind of a interpersonal dense network, or it is as a result of a multi-scaled activism of eminent activists through public hearing and using, because they are eminent, they use this symbolic capital. It borrows from the Bourdieu's concept of symbolic capital. Or there's a fourth view as well, where a particular political regime is viewed as a regime which was conducive to the idea of openness or to the idea of access to information. And that regime, in conjunction with the social activists, led to the promulgation of right to information. Using archival material, internal government documents, interviews. This book actually presents an alternative perspective in addition to some of these narratives. And I hold that right to information, change in the information regime in India, was a result of a slow-moving, gradual, incremental process of endogenous ideas emerging from within the state right since independence. This challenges a singular linear narrative of social movement or a dense interpersonal elite network, but tries to kind of brings the role of ideas and the state back in, right? How do I explain this process of slow-moving, endogenous, incremental process of ideas, endogenous ideas emerging from within the state? I have explained this through the model of layered tipping point. Tipping point has got three distinct characteristics. So the first characteristic is that the changes are ideational, evolutionary, gradual, and endogenous. The second is that across a timeline, a historical timeline, we should be able to delineate small interlinked changes which accumulate over time. And these small interlinked changes, number three, continue to evolve over time till they reach a certain threshold, right? Layering is when around a nested norm of secrecy, there's a new norm or a new idea which kind of emerges on the fringes and gradually moves to the center stage, is placed on top of the nested norm, which was the norm of secrecy in this case, and which eventually veers out, which eventually displaces the nested norm of secrecy, right? So this is the model that I use, and I see this happening in two layers. The first layer is the first phase where I actually see something happening right since independence, right? So 1947 was the time that Official Secrets Act was just adopted by the Indian state, merely removing the references to Great Britain and replacing it with India. But the logic behind it was that official information is key to protecting the state interests and to protect the national security. For national security, it is pertinent to treat all official information as secret, right? So, since 1947, the norm of secrecy was getting embedded within the system. In 67, it was actually amended to an even stronger version, supported by other laws like Civil Services Conduct Rules or Manual and Office Procedures of Government of India, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, what was happening was that on the fringes, idea of openness was emerging from three sources. Right? The first source were the government reports. Government of India constituted a number of committees right since 1950s to look at the public administration, to look at the probity in public life, and so on and so forth, right? So, or freedom of press for that matter. So right in 1947, you see this report of the Press Law Inquiry Committee, or 1953, there was this report on public administration, which was famously known as Appleby Report. And all of them actually questioned the prevailing secrecy in the government and favored some kind of an amendment to the Official Secrets Act. And Paul H. Appleby in 1953 observed, and I quote, that the new government has not yet got away from the arbitrary secrecy, unnecessarily depriving Indian university officers and citizens generally of desirable information. And this kind of sentiment continued in the 60s and the 70s. So you see this happening in 62 in the Santhanam Committee, which was constituted to suggest institutional mechanisms to check corruption. And I quote, it said in one of the places in the report, to the maximum extent possible, transaction of government business should be open. So one source was this, sporadic expression of the idea of openness on the fringes. These were rudimentary ideas by the government report. The second important source were the opposition parties, right? The root cause of these demand from opposition party was that the privilege of access to information was exclusively extended to the ruling party. So the opposition party members argued that we should also have that access. And so in 1965, a member of an opposition in the lower house, the Lok Sabha, P.K. Deo, wanted to quote from the CBI report and the Union Subcommittee report, which was actually rather damaging to two former chief ministers of Odisha. And he was, the Speaker of the House actually forbid him to quote from that report because they were confidential. And there was a demand from the opposition that, they should be able to quote from the official information as well, the documents which are secret. And so in 1965, there was this ruling by the Speaker, again, in favor of parliamentarians quoting from the confidential report. And this ruling was actually triggered by the opposition demand. So the opposition throughout has been demanding, right since the 50s and the 60s, about questioning the exclusive privilege of the ruling party. The third source, importantly, was the judiciary. There have been a number of cases since 1950s, which actually argued that, upheld the Article 19(1)A of the Indian Constitution. And the whole logic behind it, and why it was so important about, important from the point of view of the ongoing discourse within the state, was that, all these rulings treated dissemination of information as integral part of Article 19(1)(a), right? So these should be seen in conjunction with the ongoing discourse within the state, finding expression in the reports of the government committees, demands from the opposition. And in 67, as we all know, and as I've already mentioned, the Official Secrets Act was amended to an even stronger version. So there was always this push and pull between the nested norm of secrecy and this emerging norm of openness, these nascent ideas on openness, which were emerging on the fringes of the policy periphery. Indeed, when the opposition comes to power in 1975, you see that there was both commitment and policy intent of the government of that day to promulgate freedom of information, to also amend the Official Secrets Act and give some kind of a legal right to the citizens to access information from the state. The root cause of it again was that the exclusive privilege of access to information was extended just to the ruling party. And so when opposition comes to power in 1977, with the Janata Party coalition assuming power, then Home Minister Charan Singh actually constituted a cabinet level committee to examine the possibility of amending the Official Secrets Act and give some kind of a right to citizens to access information. Of course, this was thwarted because the norm of secrecy was so entrenched within the state that the committee members who were they were members of the Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Defense, members of the Cabinet Secretariat, they all thwarted this initiative. But this was the first time that a ruling party actually expressed its intention, and I see this as a kind of a link phase between the phase that I talked about in the early 50s and the 60s, and Janata Party coming to power. And indeed, judiciary as well, in a number of cases related to, in one of the most prominent cases related to the emergency, the famous Rajnarayan case actually interpreted Article 19(1)(a) as inherently containing right to know. And this was the first time judiciary was doing it, right? And so Janata Party could not, even when opposition assumed power, they could not effectuate change in the legal regime, which had been persisting since 1947. But what happened after Janata Party is that you see this, increase in policy processes within the state around right to information. You kind of see this deepening of discourse on ideas of openness. And these ideas which were on the periphery in the initial phase, right through the Janata Party, actually started slowly moving to the policy center stage, right? And so, you had these reports from the Indian Institute of Public Administration or the Law Institute of India, which actually articulated people's right to know, which articulated the exigency of people's right to know and how they are being governed. Even within the parliament, the opposition members were coming out with specific bills on freedom of information. So, for instance, in 1983, G.C. Bhattacharya, who was member of Lokdal was also part of Janata Party, actually tabled a private member's bill on freedom of information, which has somewhat of an uncanny resemblance to the present-day RTI. And this private member's bill finds no mention in most of these dominant narratives. In 1984, Subramaniam Swamy tabled the same bill in the lower house, the Lok Sabha, right? What was also happening is that you see the interlinking of ideas from the previous phase. So, for instance, judiciary in the famous S.P. Gupta case recognized and upheld the constitutional right to know. And, this report, this verdict quoted verbatim from the previous Rajnarayan case, and also the reports of which were published in 83, around early 80s by IIPA and Indian Law Institute. So you see that, ideas had actually moved progressively in this phase. They were still nascent, but they were slowly moving to the policy center stage. But again, there's a pushback from the state. So you had this in 1986, you had this proposed amendment to the Commission of Inquiry Act, which sought to empower commissions to withhold their reports and not to table them in the parliament. And this was actually, this amendment was initiated by Rajiv Gandhi. So there was always this pushback from the state. It was the ideas of openness in this phase, even though they were gaining prominence, they were still on the periphery, they were still rudiment. But, my second phase, which I call a second layer, started from 1989 to 2005. And you see in this phase, the ideas of openness, which were in the realm of opposition, actually transitioned and gained enough critical mass to move to the policy center stage and became part of the mainstream politics. How can we understand the mainstreaming of ideas? All the political parties since 1989 onwards, actually in their election manifestos promised some kind of a legislation on access to information, starting from the National Front government, the Congress government, United Front government, and then finally the National Democratic Alliance and United Progressive Alliance government in 2004. So, but these were not only political commitment, they were actually followed by concrete policy processes which were initiated within the state, right? So for instance, the National Front government in 1990 actually constituted a cabinet committee, which was called the B.S. Lali Committee, to amend Official Secrets Act and give some kind of a legal right to citizens to access information. Surprisingly, between, during the heyday of economic reforms, you find a kind of a hiatus of activity on freedom of information when Congress minority government was in power. And you would believe that, during the heyday of economic reforms, transparency and accountability would be paramount on government's agenda, but it was not. So apparently in 1994, the Department of Manual Security Instructions was actually amended to classify or declassify document according to the categories of, being confidential, top secret, secret, and so on and so forth, right? But even when there was a hiatus, you see the same thing which is happening in the 1980s, picking up from where G.C. Bhattacharya had left, picking up the thread from where the G.C. Bhattacharya had left it. Chitta Basu, who was the member of All India Forward Bloc, actually tabled another bill on freedom of information, or inserts amendment of Article 19(1)A bill in the parliament. Of course, this bill was then later on withdrawn. But what was changing was that even within the Congress party, you were finding these members who were sympathizing to the idea of openness. So Suresh Pachori, for instance, in 1992, tabled the same bill which was tabled by G.C. Bhattacharya in 83 in the lower house. United Front government also constituted a committee on H.D. Shori, famously known as H.D. Shori Committee, to examine the possibility of giving some kind of access to information to the citizens. What was happening during this phase is that the governments or the government which were in power at the central level were also creating an epistemic consensus on the issue. So for instance, there was this seminar organized on freedom of information and access to information by the National Front government, which was in Center for Policy Research under the aegis of Ministry of Home Affairs. Or in 1986, the United Front government organized the Chief Secretaries Conference, which actually unanimously recommended, and I quote, "It is necessary to introduce greater transparency and openness in the functioning of government and public bodies. This would cover, for example, movement towards a Right to Information Act." So clearly, the ideas which were on the periphery in the first layer had actually transitioned to a more prominent policy space during this phase, right? Or you had Chief Ministers Conference, for instance, in 1997. So the state was in the process of building an epistemic consensus around the issue of right to information. And all this was happening actually within the state. And these processes are actually conspicuous by its absence in the mainstream literature. And this is what this book tries to do, kind of bring in some of these interlinked changes, some of the consequential role of these ideas in leading to the evolution of right to information. But both National Front government and United Front government were short-lived. They could not follow up on their policy or political commitment. But both the governments, which was NDA government and the UPA government, actually ran throughout their tenure, 5 years. They completed their tenure of 5 years. And both these government actually went ahead and promulgated, so NDA promulgated freedom of information, and it was amended to an even kind of a stronger version of FOI bill, and UPA promulgated or legislated Right to Information Act 2005. And so clearly the ideas actually reached a tipping point about 2005. It was it was the weight and the momentum of earlier ideas which had reached a certain threshold, which had reached a critical mass in 2005. Had the state thinking not moved in a certain direction, they would have dealt with the same issue like the same way that they have been dealing with it in the past. As we have seen, there was always a pushback from the state. And so, in both during NDA and the UPA government, you see this frantic policy activity around right to information, constitution of cabinet committees, constitution of the GOMs, the group of ministers, interministerial task force, the department-related standing committees were actually discussing the possibility of the bill. It was also around this phase that we see actually the actors from the social movement, people from both within and outside the state, converging with this endogenous discourse, occurring within the state, right? So I'm in no way saying that, I acknowledge the role of social network, but had the state thinking not moved in a certain direction, they would have dealt with the same social actors in a very different way. But I'm also kind of nuancing this view that, this linear view that, social movement was consequential. Yes, of course it was consequential. Was it an interpersonal dense elite network? Well, I kind of question and problematize this viewpoint. And I argue that this was actually an epistemic network, which was taking shape when social movement was in its nascent stages in Rajasthan, way back in the early 90s. And why do I call it an epistemic network? Because each node of this network actually came in with their own epistemic characteristics, with their own specialized domain knowledge over a certain issue area. And what bound them together was this ideational connection, or this common idea around openness, this common norm around freedom of information, right to information. So, what brought them together was not that they were, they knew each other, they were interpersonal, or they were elites. What brought them together was their commitment to freedom of information. And they were, and that's why I call them epistemic network. And social movement was part of this bigger universe of, what I call the epistemic network. So for instance, there were people from the legal fraternity, people like P.V. Sawant or Prashant Bhushan or K.G. Kanibaran or A.G. Nurani, right? But this was not a simple epistemic network which was working as a kind of a social network. It was unique in the sense that they were working from both within and outside the state. And some of the endogenous discourse which was happening within the state, which I've just talked about in the first two phases, you can see some ideational connections between these phases as well, between the epistemic network and these what was happening in these phases as well. So for instance, Justice P.V. Sawant was part of the famous the 1982 S.P. Gupta case, right? Or journalists like Ajit Bhattacharjee or Prabhas Joshi, who were prominent members of this epistemic network, were actually also part of the Janata Party. the Janata Party movement, which was happening in the 70s. In fact, Ajit Bhattacharjee was the editor of Every Man's Weekly, which was an English weekly or English magazine of the Janata Party or the Janata movement, right? Or Prabhas Joshi was the editor of Prajaniti. So surely there were ideational connections between the commitment, policy and political commitment of Janata Party and their favorable view of ideas of openness during this phase. And then you had bureaucrats like S.R. Sankaran, B.N. Yugandhar, or H.R. Or Harsh Mandar, who were part of this network, who were working from both within and outside the state. Or V.P. Singh, who was the prime minister during the National Front government, was part of this epistemic network. And of course, he was giving expression to some of the nascent ideas which were actually aired or which were discussed internally within the state in 1989 when he was the prime minister, right? And so there were interlinked connections. There were ideas from before which were expressed in this network. So it was just not social movement. It was actually a universe which resembled more closely, or like it talks more to this concept of epistemic network rather than just social movement. One thing I forgot to add, and I will just finish in 2-3 minutes, Suhan, that there were also subnational movements on freedom of information and access to information. So from late 1990s, 1997 to be precise, you will see these states, subnational states, starting from Tamil Nadu, promulgating their own State Right to Information Act, right? And this happened right after the Chief Minister's Conference in 1997. I wish in the book I could have dug deeper in this subnational aspect. How did that come about? But I just simply did not have time to research more on this, and I would like to do it. Of course, it's related to, it falls right down the alley of Kailash's interest on subnationalism and federalism. But this is something which this book actually would like to elaborate on, probably in the next phase, about the subnational trends of freedom of information emerging right since the late 1990s. The last important point, and I would finish now, is about the global-local linkages. Now, is it a coincidence that between 1990 and 2010, about 76 countries have promulgated some law relating to access to information? Till now, 93 countries have actually promulgated freedom of information. This was also the time when IMF and World Bank were well-accepted doctors of economic reforms. And the conditionalities of some of these structural adjustment program, the transparency and accountability was one of the conditionalities, right? And so was it a coincidence that, how can we understand the Indian law? How can we understand the Indian right to information within this context of the global local? In one of the chapters is actually devoted to it. And I view it like this. I acknowledge the role of global norms, but in conjunction with the endogenous discourse. And I see this happening at two levels. The first level is what I call norm demonstration. The emerging norms elsewhere had a demonstrative impact on the endogenous discourse. The sympathizers of the idea of openness, sympathizers of access to information, were actually citing laws elsewhere to argue in favor of freedom of information. The second argument is about norm localization. So as the state thinking had positively moved towards towards some kind of a law on access to information, they were actively looking at laws in UK, US, New Zealand, Australia, but they were not borrowing it passively. Right? They were not passive learners of these laws existing elsewhere or best practices existing elsewhere, but they were kind of localizing it according to the endogenous discourse, what was happening at the local level. So they were calibrating it according to the local policy discourse. And this is what Amitav Acharya calls norm localization. So interestingly, if the ideas on openness were on the periphery in the first phase, the role of global norms were also on the periphery. But when the state thinking or the ideas within the state had moved, decisively towards freedom of information or access to information or right to information, global norms found suddenly more traction within the state, right? So this is how we should actually understand the global-local linkages. And of course, my future research actually looks at the emerging politics of accountability on the ground. And surely this would be a research which would actually examine how thick or how deep is this institutional change on the ground, right? What is this churning that we are talking about? So thank you, and thank you for listening to me. Looking forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Himanshu, for your very insightful and elaborate presentation. We really appreciate your insights on how ideas matter and how epistemic network accounts for institutional change with respect to the Right to Information Act in India. So before I open up for the audience, may I request Professor Kailas to flag some of the issues which entail from this presentation as well as from his reading of the text, so that we can open up for Q&A. May I also request the participants to kindly post your question in the chat box so that we'll have seamless discussion thereafter. Yeah, Professor Kailas.
So thank you, Himanshu, for this presentation. In the 15 minutes that I have, I'll do it in 3 parts. Okay. So the first part, I'll highlight why capturing institutional change by Himanshu, which I think is a very significant contribution to the study of Indian politics. In the second part of my intervention, I think I will also highlight how it opens up spaces for new research. It's something which Himanshu mentioned towards the end of his listening, but I think research scholars who are listening to Himanshu would also then could pick up ideas about institutional change and take it forward. And finally, in the last part of my intervention, I will focus on a couple of issues which I think Himanshu could elaborate when he sort of responds to questions that come about. Okay, so let's get going. So the first issue is that the study of institutions has been sort of central to the content of political analysis. Okay, so until the 1950s, as students of comparative politics will know, political science equal to institutionalism. So the focus was on the study of constitutions, the study of organizational arrangements, the study of the working of these arrangements, the mechanisms that were used, and so on. So the studies were predominantly formal, descriptive, and used the sort of legal historical method to understand how politics works. Now, in the late 50s, you have what is now well known is the behavioral revolution, which questions the formalism, and there is a stress on empirical investigation. Okay, and the whole idea behind the behavioral revolution was to unearth what is behind the formal. So for instance, the question would be who governs? Okay, so what is behind this institutional facade that we have? So basically, the behavioral revolution tells us that there is something much more than institutions to understand politics. So we need to go beyond the formal arrangements and explore what is there. Now, almost immediately after that, you have what is called the new institutionalism revolution coming up in social sciences. And there the focus is on that institutions matter and how political life is organized makes a big difference. Okay. Now, this new institutionalism is very different from the old institutionalism. And here it basically is telling us that institutions shape our behavior, shape what we can do, shape our strategies, shape our political choices that we make. And this new institutionalism moves from formal description to a more, and it sort of provides us with an analytical framework. Now, I began with this Because when we look at the state of Indian politics today, the study of Indian politics today, we can actually see that we happen to be stuck in different worlds. Okay. For instance, there is a large number of, let's say, universities, colleges across this country, where they appear to be stuck in the pre-behavioral stage. Okay. So where there is a lot of emphasis on formalism and on the descriptivism of the traditional political science or traditional comparative politics. Now, as you move towards, let's say, the more central universities and to more institutions in the metropolitan cities, etc., you find there is this impact of the behavioral revolution. Okay, so there is this focus on going beyond institutions. Now, in my reading of literature on Indian politics here, I find that despite like this, besides these two worlds, I think most people or most writings have missed the new institutional revolution that has taken place. Okay, so that impact of new institutional revolution, which has had so much work on in social sciences, in economics, has sort of, I think, bypassed, or people generally scholarship has ignored new institutionalism. This might be because of the sort of strong critique of the behavioral revolution and the training that subsequently was given to students who are now scholars across the country. So Himanshu's work is therefore, I think, a very useful intervention because it brings back institutions. Okay, it brings institutions. And I think more importantly, I think it also shows us that political institutions can be understood slightly differently. And it also shows us that when you think of institutions, I think it's also to do with what ordinary people or what citizens can do with institutions, what citizens can't do with institutions. I think this comes out if you were to read the book. So it's almost more about a lot about not merely the capacities of those in government and the actors in the political sphere, but I think it is also about the opportunities that citizens have, how political institutions shape citizens, and how we can make ourselves heard to the political realm. So this understanding of institutions, drawing from new institutional framework, allows us to sort of participate in decision making. It allows us to sort of access public services, which we can see, which came out as a result of, which we will see, or in the book Himanshu does highlight, but it doesn't go into the working of the RTI. But you do read a lot of newspaper vignettes which actually tell us how RTI has helped people have access to public services. So I think Himanshu's work therefore moves beyond, as he said, the existing explanations, that is the structuralist explanation, which sort of prioritizes the socio-economic structures and roles. And it also sort of moves beyond the behavioralist approach, which focuses simply on observation of actors. Okay. Now, Himanshu's work, this particular work, that is, it also then focuses on institutional change, which has, I think, been completely ignored in the study of Indian politics. Okay, you don't see much work on how institutions change. Whereas I think this has been a very fruitful area of research in social science literature. And I think in India, we have sort of ignored this. And this book here, I think, also demonstrates, as the last slide in his presentation also showed, I think there is this enthusiasm for institutionalism. And I think he believes deeply that it works both as in terms of a method, and it also provides us with a theoretical framework. Second, I think his work also gives us crucial insights into certain political issues, and also he didn't make it in his presentation, but there is a lot of it in his book about the linkage between state and society, the conflicts between groups, society, and the state. So this also comes out in his study of institutional. So that's my first part about why this book is significant and why anybody interested in Indian politics should actually read this book. Now I move on to the second part of it, and I think this book could not have come out at a more appropriate time. When we look around us, we see a lot of institutional change taking place. Okay, and I can just, on the back of my head, I think of three issues in the last 6 or 7 years. One is, let's say, the removal or the abrogation of Article 370 with respect to Jammu and Kashmir, which questions the idea of asymmetrical federalism and its usefulness. Now, we do not have answers about what pushed this change. Okay, how did this change actually come about? So this is, I think, an exciting area which somebody could look at. Second, one could also look at, let's say, the replacement of the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog. There's a huge transformation that has taken place, waiting for somebody to do research on. Third, we can see, look around us. That's with respect to farm laws. Okay, how is this attempt being made to move from a MSP regime, that is minimum support price based regime, to a more market-based system? Okay, how does the state actually go about doing this? I think this is also worth, these are, I think, questions that are worth answering. And I think all these three issues that I sort of highlight, I think, fit in with the framework of institutional change, or why we should consider these as institutional change, which Himanshu mentioned. I think there is a norm shift, there is departure from the past, which is evident in all three. Now, to the last part of my of this intervention with regard to Hima, and here I have a couple of questions that I would like Himanshu to sort of elaborate subsequently. First, while you start with the idea that you look at why, what, and how, I am not sure whether the why part of it actually came out very clearly. Okay, in my reading and in the presentation, the why I thought was still at the background. The how and the what came out really well. Okay, it's very well argued. But the why, I'm still thinking of why would the state actually want to expose its underbelly? That doesn't come out, or that at least I didn't get it when I read it first. Because one, if you look at the traditional understanding of, let's say, bureaucracy, or the understanding of administration, it sort of excludes people. Okay, and Weber himself said that official secrecy is an invention of the bureaucrats. Okay, and they fanatically defend this. Now, this RTI, or any sort of right to information sort of free movement or open government sort of setup, questions this Weberian ideal type of bureaucratic administration. Okay, so for Weber, as someone would say that open government would be actually an oxymoron. Now, in your study, I thought your engagement with the bureaucracy was limited. While you did speak of the epistemic community and their linkages that you showed in that one of the slides, but I think that was inadequate because it doesn't actually engage with the bureaucracy, and it doesn't actually deal with the beast called bureaucracy. Okay, there are, as I can see, there are a couple of public-spirited, right-minded bureaucrats who are interested in a more transparent, open government. But this doesn't explain the change. So while you speak of the state as a legislature, while there is political executive, then there is the permanent executive, then there is the judiciary. I think of all the four or five dimensions that you sort of use to conceptualize the state, I think the permanent executive, that is the bureaucracy, was at the background and did not necessarily come out very strongly in your presentation and in the book. Now, this might then, I could then ask you whether you were yourself constrained by, let's say, the civil service conduct rules of 1964, which you mentioned, which prohibit sharing of official information without proper authority. So the first thing is that is about bureaucracy, because I think that is what will allow for change, or whether that is the crucial to understanding of why RTI came out. Because if you push the bureaucracy aside and just simply speak of the opposition and the political executive, I think that's not enough. I think it's the bureaucracy which has to change and make this transition. So the question that I have is that why did the bureaucracy agree to this change? Okay. Second, in your presentation and in the book, you speak of change as being endogenous, you speak of change as being incremental, gradual. Now, if change is endogenous and if it is coming from within, okay, I thought you should have also then engaged with the idea that if something comes from within, then I think there are also limits to the type of change that will take place. Okay, because institutions, as you will know, have distributional implications. Okay, any institution, any rule, any regulation has these distributional implications. So consequently, someone benefits from a particular framework and there is somebody who is at a disadvantage. And those who benefit from a particular framework, existing framework, will attempt to maintain status quo or actually further strengthen their position. Now, this then is connected to the first thing. Why does it give away? But then second, I could then ask you, I know it's not part of your work, but can this explain why the way in which the RTI is framed? Okay, you do mention it in one of the chapters. So why the way in which the RTI is framed is actually framed in such a way to make the bureaucracy elusive, to keep the bureaucracy unanswerable. Okay, for instance, I can just pick up random, which comes here again, is the idea of how RTI applications are to be worded. Okay, now it's required to be worded in a particular manner. I think there are also word limits to what you can put there. I think you should, they should also, the way in which it's, when you expect somebody to write an RTI application, it also assumes that the person has some sort of technical literacy to put in that application. Of course, there are people who do it for you, but I think this then gives the state the power to open and close spaces depending on a particular issue. Okay, so this then might explain, and you probably could look at it and see if it works like this, that it might explain why the RTI actually becomes more of a grievance redressal mechanism rather than as an information dissemination or a transformation entity. Okay, that's the second issue that I had. And finally, a small minor point, of course, it was not there in the presentation, is about your look at the judiciary and the way in which the RTI comes out. You have 2 chapters on the judiciary. You also divide the judiciary into 2 phases. Now, however, in my reading of both those chapters, it appeared as if the judiciary is sort of a detached entity. It is sort of unhinged from what is happening around it. And in a way, it is also in variance, from my understanding, with other literature on the judiciary. Okay, I think other literature on the judiciary and in terms of how they make these divisions into different eras of the judiciary, I think it's slightly more complicated. Okay, there is some sort of a relationship between political regimes and the way in which the judiciary functions. So somewhere could you have actually brought that into the discussion rather than just simply keeping it as a discussion of cases, but look at the relationship between the nature of the political regime and the way in which the judiciary acts, those 2 phases that you have. Okay, and this is also then, I think, same issue is linked with your the last idea about the global local connection that you make. And while you do speak of the role of the IMF and the World Bank, one would also then expect that I expected a little more discussion on how the changing nature of the economy and the economic changes sort of push governments to go for greater transparency. I think the new sort of capital economy has certain requirements, and this RTI comes as part of that baggage. So I thought in both in the case of the judiciary and in case of the global local linkages, I thought it should have been a slightly more complicated attempt, but I understand that your focus was on endogenous change. But I thought if you were to complicate this, then it might have sort of highlighted these 4 dimensions really well. Nevertheless, I think it's a wonderful contribution to understanding both how institutions work and, more importantly, on institutional change in the context of India. So while in your book you say that when people study institutional change, they do not look at the countries in the south, but I think even in India we do not have some work. So I think your work is a welcome contribution, and thank you for this, Himanshu.
Yeah, thank you, Kailas, for those very helpful and probing questions. I hope Himanshu would be willing to respond to some of the questions that you raised. So the floor is yours, Himanshu. Yeah.
Thanks, Kailash. What would a good discussion be without searching questions? And there are three very searching questions which are there on the table. The first is about the permanent executive. And as you have rightly pointed out, the discussion on permanent executive is, not thin in this book, but it is just captured in a way which is related to the case, which is the case of freedom of information on right to information. And so the why idea, why, is actually connected to this argument about ideas. I'm making kind of a structural argument and not an agency-centric argument, so to speak, where I, kind of giving a cognitive map, existing map within the state of how ideas within the state actually move in a certain direction. And, there are a number of sources to it. So, for instance, the government committees which were constituted, the reports of the government committees, somewhere in the book I have actually mentioned they were, they can be also regarded as technocrats. For instance, Appleby was this great public administration guy invited by the Ford Foundation. Then I think the Ministry of Finance, C.B. Deshmukh. His report was the first report on public administration in India. And he recommended the Constitution. He recommended that India should set up something called the Organization and Methods Division and Indian Institute of Public Administration. And if you see the annual, and somewhere in the book I have mentioned it, if you see the annual report of 1955, it has a bearing of what Appleby was saying about the prevailing secrecy in the government. In 1955, the annual report of Organization and Methods Division was actually advocating opening of official information to, academics, to journalists and so on and so forth. And of course, IIPA was constantly, reports from IIPA right through the late 60s or the early 80s were categorically expressing ideas on openness, favoring ideas on openness. So there was a kind of a movement of ideas which I'm tracing through different phases, and I call it layers. But so entrenched was the norm of secrecy within the state that, even if there were ideas which were expressed in favor of norm of openness, they were invariably thwarted by the bureaucracy, right? So for instance, the Home Minister Charan Singh was even thwarted by the bureaucracy because, the logic was that the official information is key to state interests and protecting national interests. And information was also power, as you have rightly pointed out. So there was a lot of reluctance in giving away that power. So, my argument is that, that's why ideas matter, and ideas actually shape interests rather than the other way around. In Indian politics, there is a plethora of literature which talks about, dominant interests on the ground, putting pressure on the state, and the state yields to that pressure. My argument is somewhat different. My argument is the other way around. My argument is that, the ideas within the state, the political power of ideas actually shape prevailing interests within the state. And so from the second phase, the 1989 onwards, you not only see some kind of a commitment towards freedom of information by the political executive, but also by the permanent executive. So you had, B.S. Lali committee was part of this process. Interestingly, in 1995 or 6, the UP IES Association actually adopted a resolution on promulgating something similar to right to information, or there should be access to information. So, and this is part of the record. They actually adopted this resolution, or the Chief Secretary's Conference of 1997. So, my argument is because the ideas gained political traction within this, there were mainstreaming of ideas. The political executive, some segments of it were also, in favoring openness. But if you see this granular account of what was happening within the committees, within the group of ministers, the GOMs, I have access to the meetings, the minutes of these meetings. You will always see this churning which is taking place, right? So there are advocates of this norm of openness, and there are these opposers of freedom of information, and most of them are bureaucrats. So Ministry of Home Affairs, for instance, was completely against it, or Ministry of Defense was completely against it, against the idea of the bill, right? And so you see this churning which is taking place, and which bears out in the minutes of the committees and so on and so forth, which, a lot of these details are in the footnotes, where you see this kind of a churning happening between the nested norm of secrecy and the norm of openness. But, the political power of ideas was such that even these uncertainties were actually ironed out later on, right? So that is my kind of take on it. The second thing which is very important about the epistemic network, and why I kind of stress so much about this epistemic network, is that, this epistemic network was instrumental in ironing out the uncertainties, the very uncertainties which prevailed within the permanent executive, right? And why they were able to do it so successfully, especially during the later half of 2004 and 2005, with the establishment of the National Advisory Council, is that, because they were working from both within and outside the state. A lot of these actors were moving through the porous borders of state and society and effectively ironing out some of the differences, right? And so the political power of ideas was such that the ruling party, which was resisting it right since independence, had to adopt it, right? Before 2005, the longest ruling party in India was not in favor of promulgating right to information or freedom of information. It was only opposition parties. So National Front government was in favor of it. The moment the minority government of the Congress party came to power, you see this hiatus of activities around both political and policy processes, right? But in 2005, this is what I argue, 2005 is somewhat of a tipping point, because the earlier weight of ideas had reached a critical mass. So my argument is more ideational rather than just interest-based. And, the role of, and this is what explains the why, so to speak, which comes out categorically, in different phases. The second question is about this gradual endogenous change. And in fact, in what way the state, the nitty-gritties of the law, right? How it formed its. Now, when the legislation was actually promulgated, it, like any other law in India, it is open to interpretation, right? So for instance, if we take the example of the private bodies being included as part of right to information, the activists, people who use right to information interpret it as, yes, private bodies who receive some kind of fund or who are under scrutiny of the government or the state is under RTI, but they, on the other hand, argue that we are not. So it is subject to interpretation. And as you have rightly pointed out, right to information from the beginning have been this subject of interpretation. And the relationship between the demand and the supply side have since beginning being a tumultuous relationship. And this is something which, this is something which is a topic of future research, which shows some promise, right? On what issues does the state shut, or on what issues does the state opens up? Or who are the users of RTI? Are they just limited to the citizens? Or is there as my work on Bihar shows, that there are core of RTI users who are popularly known as RTI activists, and I have termed them as agents of accountability. They are different from the agents earlier, agents which were earlier discussed in the literature, like Naya Netas, or Rosenthal calls this expansive elites, who are like these conduit between the traditional state and the modern society. These new agents of accountability actually seek accountability from the state, right? These are new agents which seek accountability, not unlike the previous phase where they act as conduit between the state and society. So these are some potential areas of research which I call institutional progression rather than part of institutional change, so to speak, right? How once the legal norm has changed, how it kind of travels on the ground. And, yes, it has been interpreted. Judiciary, right? Judiciary is an interesting case. And, yes, there have been allegations that I've actually cherry-picked my cases to suit my argument. But I have also kind of given it a disclaimer, and on account of space, I have not got into that discussion. The journey of judiciary is no way I'm claiming a linear journey, right? So the interpretation of Article 19(1)(a) no way has been a linear interpretation that dissemination of information is important for a democracy and that right to know is inherently a part of Article 19(1)(a). It has judiciary. So for instance, the famous case, the ADM Jabalpur case, right? The habeas corpus, which is known as the habeas corpus case, Article 19(1)(a) was not upheld, right? Judiciary ruled in favor of the state that they can actually arrest anybody they like without any reason, rhyme or reason, right? And so, except for the whole judicial bench, except for one exception of Justice Khanna, who expressed his dissent on, even Justice P.B. Sawant, who was part of this epistemic network, actually ruled in favor of the state, right? And later on in 2012, we actually admitted that political ideologies do color the judicial verdicts. So on hindsight, he regretted doing that. So in no way judiciary's journey is linear. But what judiciary is doing is, and that's why I have kind of divided the judicial verdict in two phases, is that, coincidentally or as part of the endogenous discourse, it is actually emerging in conjunction with what is happening within the state elsewhere. So if the ideas on openness are on the nascent, in the nascent form, on the periphery, judiciary is also not directly interpreting Article 19(1)(a) as inherently containing right to know. It is just interpreting tangentially Article 19(1)(a) as important for disseminating information, ruling in favor of ruling in favor of freedom of press, right? But in the second phase, as the state thinking kind of moves in a certain direction favorably towards openness, you see number of judicial cases actually directly interpreting right to know as inherently containing in the Constitution, right? So you have Dinesh Trivedi case, you have Raj Narayan case, you have SP Gupta case. Later on, you have PUCL cases, number of cases where, Article 19(1)(a) is actually interpreted as integral part of citizens' right to know, right? So judiciary that way is very important. And, indeed, there were ideational connections between what was happening elsewhere and judicial verdicts. So a lot of these judicial verdicts were actually borrowing from these government reports. A lot of these judicial verdicts were actually discussing the cases happening in the parliament, right? So there were ideational connections which were established, which I have tried to establish in the book. And maybe to some extent I have also failed, and that's why the questions. But this is how I have viewed the judiciary. The last question about the IMF and the World Bank, and the conditionalities, is RTI part of that package? And of course, that is a very important question. But I kind of counter it with a counterfactual. During the heyday of economic reforms, when IMF and World Bank had kind of the most traction within the Indian thinking, states thinking, you had an amendment which actually strengthened the norm of secrecy. You had an amendment which actually further weakened the citizens' right to know, right? So if at all government was about to please IMF and World Bank to kind of cater to these conditionalities, they would not have gone ahead with these, amendment. And indeed, these amendments were actually opposed by a lot of members of the opposition parties in the parliament during that time. And so, IMF and World Bank, in my view, and also the government papers don't discuss it. Government papers relating to the right to information, or the internal minutes of these GOMs and the cabinet committees actually don't discuss World Bank and IMF at all. And my account is just relying on these official papers. So if you would notice, I'm also not relying very much on the interviews. Interviews are just corroborating what the papers are saying. So I'm just kind of relying on these primary documents. And so these are some kind of broad responses to your wonderful comments, Kailash. But one thing is something which actually falls right on in your alley, is about these subnational initiatives which were taken in the late 1990s, which is something one needs to kind of dig deeper into. Thanks, Suhan.
Yeah, thanks, Himanshu, for those very thoughtful response. Kailash, do you have a quick rejoinder to Himanshu's response to your queries?
No, we'll go ahead. There are a lot of questions on the chat.
Yeah. So let's go ahead with some of the questions asked. So the first question is by Arun P, who asks, does RTI Act also bring institutional change in right to fair trial, human rights, and criminal law process? And there is this interesting question by Mustafis, who asks, you began your talk by stating that the Indian state is captured by vested interest group, and that this class benefit from the stickiness of institution. The question you posed was, why then would they want a change? You did have detail on evolutionary part, from norm of secrecy to norm of openness, and you did have demonstrated the ideational evolution within the political executive and in the technocracy. Okay, so how would the Dominion coalition that Pranab Bardhan used in his book be different from your idea of vested interest group, and why would they support a change in the milieu of RTI is the question. So you may like to take up these two questions first, then we'll proceed to further questions. Yeah, thank you, Himanshu. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Arun and Mia. Arun, your question on institutional change, these are some of the, what I call institutional progression, some of the byproducts of right to information. I would not regard institutional change, but there are surely interconnections in the sense that, the government or the governance processes which were carried out in, behind the veil of secrecy is now open to scrutiny after right to information. And so willy-nilly, it connects to the right, the human rights issue. And also because right to information has been kind of instrumental in exposing both grand and petty corruption on the ground. It is part of the, greater scrutiny of the state. Whether it is affecting the criminal law process is something which is still an open question. I don't see whether, how it affects the criminal law process, but it is surely exposing both grand and petty corruption on the ground. And these are some of the kind of a side byproducts of right to information. But, right to information, as Kailash was pointing out, is not a grievance redressal system, right? It's a kind of a right which is given to citizens to seek information from the state, and how citizens use that information is something which is up to the citizens, right? Whether they just use this information to expose corruption on the ground, or whether they just use this information to kind of put vital information in the public domain, or whether journalists use it to write stories, that is something which is which holds a lot of potential for future research about how this information is used once a person or a citizen actually gets access to that information, right? That is something which is a very interesting strand of research. And I've kind of done some research in Bihar, the eastern state of Bihar, where I've kind of looked at how RTI is being used on the ground. And kind of it throws open some interesting insights, which I would like to kind of pursue in future. The second question is about Pranab Bardhan's work on the political, about this coalition, the dominant coalition, which Pranab Bardhan talks about the vested group. My argument is not so much about vested groups or the nature of these vested interests or nature of these clientelistic exploitative nexus which prevails on the ground. I mean, surely there is a whole body of literature which reflects on it, starting from Bardhan, Kohli, patronage politics, and Kanchan Chandra's patronage politics, clientelism, whole body of literature on clientelism which looks at that. My entry point to this whole argument is to actually wonder, to actually puzzle that why would state open up to scrutiny about something which it would be something which would be used to open up the state itself, to kind of put state under the scrutiny. Why would they open up a legal regime which would be used variously to highlight the very nexus which is set to govern these institutions, in the sense that surely RTI has been instrumental in exposing most of the major scams which have exposed business politics nexus, which has exposed nexus, the local nexus which exists between the politicians, the village head, the mukhia, and the BDO's office. So it has exposed a lot of these nexus working on the ground. If you see the insights on the ground, if you talk to the village mukhia, and in Bihar, I have kind of experienced it many times. They themselves admit that, gone are the days when they would just write anything in the file and they would not be, hold accountable, right? They would not be held accountable. So, interestingly, on the ground, there are rivals to that mukhia who are actually filing RTIs day in and day out in the hope that they will nail the mukhia, right? And this is the emerging politics of accountability which is emerging on the ground. And that is when this nexus of vested interests will actually become more relevant, right? To actually see the kinds of these nexus or vested interests which are being exposed through RTI, or whether it is actually giving rise to new forms of corruption, right? That is something which is interesting. So that's my response to Mia's question.
Yeah, so you may also like to take up the question by Soumya and to Bhim's question. Soumya wonders if you could, explicate the term, the tipping point model that you use. Soumya suggests that it was also used by Professor Mukherjee, Rahul Mukherjee, in his work as well. And Bhim's question is about, is information secrecy regime neutral? And how would study on transparency and information in comparative political system, work in the context of authoritarianism? And given that informations are now being weaponized by the state against the governed, then vice versa, including liberal democracy. So you may like to take up these two questions.
Yes, Soumya, thanks for the question. Yes, and Professor Mukherjee is also my mentor. So there's an ideational collaboration between me and my mentor, and I have used tipping point as he has used to explain tipping point to show the transition, to explain the economic reform story of 1991. But RTI's story is somewhat different from economic reforms, in the sense that if you have read Professor Mukherjee carefully, Rahul's work is actually looking at kind of an aborted reform in 1966 and a successful reform in 1991. So he has kind of a non-linear narrative of tipping point. Of course, he uses tipping point. Mine is more of a linear movement of ideas. There is no counter 1966 here. There is only 2005, or there's only 2003 when freedom of information was thing. And that's why I kind of added layering in my tipping point. It is more of a layered movement of ideas, where in the first layer, it is just part of the policy periphery. These ideas are nascent and rudimentary. Whereas in the second layer, the second phase, which I'm talking about, the ideas are actually gain political power and become part of the mainstream politics. But yes, there is a close affinity to Rahul's work and my work, because both of us have worked on similar models, and so have a lot of other people like Peter Hall, Mahoney and Thelen. All these Mark Blyth, all these scholars have actually looked at how ideas matter and why ideas matter. And there's, of course, whole body of literature on historical institutionalism. But, in case of India, these are probably the only two works which actually use a historical institutional lens to explain institutional change. And that's why, you see a kind of an ideational affinity of both these works, right? And of course, at the end of the day, you have to please your mentor, right? So that is, no, I'm just kidding. So that's more of a ideational collaboration. Now, Bhim's question about, and that's a longish question. Let me kind of digest it a little bit. In your study of transparency, information in comparative political system, how do you see the role of such policies, rights in the context of increasing authoritarianism? Besides, we also find information being weaponized by the state against the governed, then vice versa, including liberal democracies. Is this information secrecy regime neutral? Definitely not. It's not a regime which is just favoring the citizens in the sense that there are always pulls and pressure. So if RTI was a result of this ideational churning, which actually emerged right since independence, there's yet another kind of churning which is now taking place after 2005 between the state and citizens. And if you would see the journey of right to information post its promulgation, you will see that journey has always been this tumultuous journey where the states have actually tried to dilute the law from time to time. There's also tendency of most of the information commissioners being former bureaucrats. So of course they would be sympathetic to their own genus. And yet, despite that, you see a kind of an extensive use of right to information on the ground, right? Even after 2019 amendment, citizens day in and day out have been actually demanding crucial information from the state to put in the public domain. So for instance, this whole question of whether the state consulted with the farmers' lobby. The agriculture minister claimed that he has, but later on through RTI papers, it was revealed that they have not consulted the farmers' lobbies or the farmers' groups, right? Or how much money the PMO spends on its ad, things like that. So there's a constant barrage of information-seeking initiatives from the citizens, even after this 2019 amendment. And that's why I see another kind of churning which is taking place between secrecy or the norm of secrecy and the emerging norm of openness. And this is the politics that one needs to kind of look at. Information which is used to kind of weaponize, in a weaponized form. Of course, that kind of information is something which actually used both by the state as well as by the citizens group to actually question the state, right? And that's why I see it as part of this broader churning which is taking place at both the political and social level, right? So this is like the long-winding, non-conclusive answer to your question, Bhim, but that is something which needs to be actually probed in future.
Yeah, thank you, Himanshu. Professor Venkatesh raised a hand, so we'll give him an opportunity to, interact with you. Yeah, please go ahead.
I have a set of questions to the speaker, but the limitation is that I have neither read your book nor even in the presentation also in between there was some disturbance. So some of the slides I could not see. But my enthusiasm to make some comments is that because up to 3 stages I was involved, because I was a participant observer at the time of agitation for the Right to Information Act and drafting of the Right to Information Act in Rasamand, Udaipur, and then Devdung.
Your voice broke up. Your voice is not clear.
Yeah, Professor Venkatesu, your voice is somehow breaking. Can you fix it?
Rajasthan. Second thing is that
Can
Professor
you,
E. Venkatesh.
Professor Venkatesh, can you paraphrase? You see, some of the, your point, your voice was breaking, so we cannot fully hear you raise the question. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Rephrase it. Yeah.
Yeah. First thing is that I was in participant observer in the agitation for the Right to Information Act as well as drafting at the time of the drafting of the Right to Information Act. Second thing is that I was involved in the capacity building right from the Gram Panchayat level to the national level on Right to Information Act, including Bihar Institute of Public Administration. And third one is that in the initial stage, we also did some evaluation about the Right to Information Act. Okay, so with these 3 experiences, let me raise certain questions. One is that you have from your presentation, I understood that you have basically looking at the Right to Information Act only from the ruling and opposition party politics point of view, rather than the grassroots level politics point of view. It was behind the Right to Information Act. It is the poorest of the poor people, landless agricultural labor, the illiterate poor people in the. I have seen in the series of the villages. I can't say that in Rajasthan it is villages, but in the hamlets and in this Doop, Mitti, Pattar, Pahada, Ilak, locating of the one house to another house is for 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers distance. So I have visited a few hundreds of people. I met them. So these are the poorest of the poor people, landless people, with the slogan that "Hamara paisa, Hamara hisab." Harat ko kaam deo, kaam ka pura daam deo. These are the kind of slogans which were raised by the Mazdoor Kisan Sangathan, and in fact, I also wrote some pieces on that. So that is the one question: is that in your presentation there is hardly any focus on the role of the grassroots level politics, the community, the people, the citizen assertion for the Right to Information Act to abolish set aside the Official Secrets Act. Second is that this Right to Information Act is not questioning the institution of this Max Weberian notion of the bureaucracy. It is just a reform within the institution, like our 19th century social reform in the Indian social structure, social system. This is also not to set aside the institution of the bureaucracy, just to bring about some sort of a reforms in response to the citizen demand for the openness in the administration. Second is the kind of coalition politics. Unless until you enact this act in 2000, you make an electoral agenda by the Congress party, it is not possible to Congress party to come to the political power. So that mandate is also one must be taken into account. So therefore, it is not questioning the Max Weberian notion of the bureaucracy. It is simply a reform. Again, it is been reinforced with certain concessions to the citizens by the institution of the bureaucracy. That is the second. Third one is that when you look at retrospectively, almost it is about 1.5 decades it has been completed. Probably by 2025 it will be completed in 2 decades of its implementation process. When you look at the socio-economic profile of the people who have been demanding the information from the public authorities or institutions, is that
He seemed to be having some network issue there. Professor Venkatesu, can you hear us? I think Himanshu, he seems to have some network issues. So would you like to respond to one of the questions that he raised?
Yes. The first question is very important, and RTI, the social movement question which was asked. And in fact, chapter 4 of my book actually traces the grassroots movement. And I thought, due to the limited time, I actually go into details about, how MKSS was formed, what were the linkages which were formed. But, my argument is, my core argument of this book is actually somewhat different in the sense that I kind of challenge. Thank you, Professor Venkateswaru. I was just responding to your first question. My first claim is that, one needs to kind of understand it as a long drawn, slow moving process where kind of, and the moment you kind of do that, you problematize the dominant singular linear narrative about social movement. I'm not at all saying that social movement is non-consequential. What I'm saying is that, other parts, other discourse or other ideas which were discussed within the state are also equally important. And that's why it is important to bring back the ideas and the discourse within the state right since independence. Why do I say that? Okay. It's a methodological issue. Most of the narrative on the evolution of RTI actually emerges around the early 90s, right? That's the entry point. But RTI, the norm of openness, has to be understood in the context of the norm of secrecy. Where does RTI come from? RTI comes from the other norms or the legal regime, like the Official Secrets Act or the Civil Services Conduct Rules. So it has to be understood in the secrecy concept, secrecy openness, or the context of secrecy, right? So, methodologically, you kind of redefine the point of departure, right? You redefine the point of entry. So for me, the point of entry is not the social movement, the 1990s, but the point of entry is when this whole discourse on the norm of secrecy or on whether we should have the norm of secrecy or norm of openness started right since independence, right? So the moment I redefine the point of departure, there's a whole new body of historical evidence which opens up, which finds no mention in the dominant literature. So for instance, this first bill, which was tabled by the Indian parliamentarian G.C. Bhattacharya of Lokdal in 1983, right? Or this opposition or the ruling by the Speaker of Lok Sabha in 1965, Hukum Singh, right? Or the Appleby report of 1953. None of these. So, the contribution of this book is to kind of bring some of this evidence to bear in the whole narrative, so it's kind of setting the history straight kind of exercise. But I'm not saying that social movement does not matter. I'm saying that, yes, it matters. And, all those slogans, Hamara Paisa, Hamara Hisab, Har Kaam ko Har Haath ko Har Kaam, and all that, which started from this movement of right to work in Rajasthan and other parts of India, is actually traced in chapter 4 of the book in great detail. So, I'm kind of problematizing the singular linear narrative, which is the dominant narrative, so to speak. The second question is about RTI in response to the institutional change, RTI as case of institutional change. Yes, how can, there is no policy precursor before RTI, right? How can you just call it part of the organizational structure? It is not. It is something which is a right, which was not part of any policy recommendation by the government. It actually represents a policy departure. And that's why it is a valid case of institutional change. RTI cannot be equated with other rights-based legislations. The second thing is, other rights-based legislations, there's a crossover between the directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights, right? So for instance, right to work is now right to life. Right to information, there is no crossover between directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights. It is interpreted as part of Article 19(1)(a), right? Which is freedom of expression and speech. So that's why I'm saying that it is a case of institutional change and not just part of the organizational structure, right? It is just, and that's why it should not also be confused as just policy change, right? Policy change is different from institutional change. This is my contention. And I somehow missed your third point, Professor Venkateswaru. You were breaking when you were posing the third question, but I don't know whether we have time to.
Yeah, Professor Venkatesu, yeah, can you quickly add up to what you missed out because of the network issue? Yeah, please.
Yeah, third one is that see, when you look at this socio-economic profile of the beneficiaries of the Right to Information Act, it is the rural, illiterate, poorest of the people, poor people who fought for the Right to Information Act, whereas the beneficiaries were happens to be the elite, rich section, and those people are in the power positions. That is the contrasting picture that has been emerging when you look at Central Information Commission and State Right to Information Commission annual reports as well as the field level, because even in Jharkhand, Rajasthan, or many states, these whistleblowers, those people you referred as the agents of transparency, they are being killed.
Yes.
They are representing basic value for the poorest of the poor people. But whereas an IAS officer demands for the information under Right Information Act, they are getting easily. But whereas an activist as a whistleblower demand for the information, they are giving killed. Whether it is a Maharashtra, it was happened, and then Jharkhand, it was several such instances. Even in Assam, it was happened. That is the one. And I think final one is that Kailash has raised the right question, because the IMF issue has been involved. When you look at before introduction of the National Right to Information Act, before some of the states have introduced the Right to Information Acts. This Tamil Nadu introduced, Madhya Pradesh, this Jammu Kashmir, Delhi, Maharashtra. Maharashtra Right to Information Act was one of the finest act, but whereas Tamil Nadu and Madhya Pradesh acts were introduced just for the to fulfill the conditionalities of the IMF. So that historic, that background, that historical phase is also existed. So these are the question. Thank you.
Yeah, Himanshu, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, you are absolutely right. The agents of accountability, I think India is the only country where, the right to information activists are being killed, threatened, or even false cases are being registered against them on the ground. And that is something which needs to be kind of looked at as well, that who uses the RTI, why do they use it? What are the kind of relationships between the information giver and the information seeker? But surely there's a new space for accountability which has opened up on the ground. If IS officers use it, there are minuscule level of IS, minuscule number of IS, the recent studies by NCPRI shows that it's only probably 2% of the total RTI applications that bureaucrats actually use it. It's mostly, people on the ground. But there are innovations on the ground as well which have come up. So for instance, in Bihar, there was this innovation called Jankari, where you can actually just, it was an RTI call center where, even if you are poor and you are illiterate, you can actually give a call to this Jankari call center and file an RTI. You don't actually have to go to a BDO's office or district collector's office to file an RTI, right? These innovations are also taking place. So this is something which needs to be researched further, and I'm sure it will throw some interesting insights. About what I missed out on the last part about the Central Information Commission.
IMF and some of the state acts.
Yes, the IMF and the World Bank. Yes, that is, the state acts is something that I wanted to dig deeper, which I could not. And I cannot for sure say it happened because of IMF and World Bank, because the state processes that I have looked at in this book are based on the evidence that I've got from the field. Most of it is government papers, official archives, and so on and so forth. And so I have traced the Madhya Pradesh Right to Information Act. I have traced the Rajasthan Right to Information Act in detail. And surely these two had IMF and World Bank had no bearing on these subnational movements. And surely at the national level, IMF and World Bank definitely had no bearing, right? But I have not looked at, and I concede, I have not looked at Tamil Nadu or Goa or other acts. How did they come about? Simply because I just did not have time or money to do it. And also I did not find much evidence, primary evidence, which will help me write intelligibly and about these 2 or 3 cases that we are talking about. And that is something which again, is something which we need to kind of dig deeper in future. How did Tamil Nadu Act come about, or how did Goa Act come about? We need to kind of visit these states and look at some of the archives and government papers, and use RTI to throw light on how RTI came about in these states, right? So thank you, Professor Venkatesu, for these wonderful questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Any quick closing thoughts from the event coordinator, Anaga? Any quick closing thoughts?
No, Professor Swan, we're good.
Okay, yeah. So everything good has to come to an end. So we'd like to once again thank Himanshu for the very thoughtful and very insightful presentation, which is eloquent as usual. We'd also like to thank Professor Kailas for his very, very probing questions and for flagging, the larger implication of the issue raised by the book. And we'd like to thank the participants for asking those very, very useful and helpful questions to the author. We'd look forward to more such interaction. And since Himanshu is also branching out to other very interrelated and equally important domain of accountability, we hope that we would get to see the outcome of his research very soon, and we look forward to having him again, maybe in another platform, physically if possible. If he happens to come to Hyderabad, he is most welcome to. Thank you once again, and it has always been a pleasure to host young and very knowledgeable resource person. We really benefit from your presentation, and we would like to thank you profusely for this. Thank you once again, and have a good evening, and have a good day, Himanshu. Thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good one, and thank you for having me here.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Bye for now. Thank you.